The bullet missed Harper Ashford's head by inches, splintering the weathered wood of the saloon doorframe as she stumbled into the dusty street of Durango, Colorado. Her hands shaking so violently she could barely keep her grip on the leather satchel containing everything she owned in this world. It was the summer of 1878, and the afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the mountain town, casting harsh shadows across the rutted Main Street, where prospectors, ranchers, and drifters moved with the casual wariness of people who had learned that death could arrive as suddenly as a summer storm. Harper didn't look back at the man who had fired that shot, her former employer's hired gun, sent to retrieve the evidence she had stolen, evidence that could hang half the corrupt businessmen in the Colorado Territory if it ever reached a judge who cared about justice more than bribes. She ran, her boots kicking up clouds of dust, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted of fear and desperation. The buildings blurred past her, the general store, the blacksmith's forge, the boarding house with its peeling paint and crooked sign, and she knew with a sickening certainty that she had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, no hope of survival beyond the next few minutes unless she found somewhere to hide. Another shot rang out, and this time the bullet struck the ground near her feet, sending up a spray of dirt. Harper veered left into an alley between two buildings, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. The alley was narrow and dark, filled with empty crates and discarded bottles, and it led to a dead end, a high wooden fence that she could never climb in her long skirts and exhausted state. She pressed herself against the fence, gulping air, trying to think through the panic that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Behind her, she heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, the sound of a man who knew his prey was cornered and had all the time in the world to finish the job. "Come on out, Miss Ashford," a voice called, rough and amused. "Mr. Blackwell just wants his property back. You give me those papers and I'll make it quick. You make me work for it and I'll take my time." Harper closed her eyes, her fingers tightening on the satchel. She had been so foolish to think she could make a difference, that she could expose the men who had destroyed her family's ranch, who had killed her father and driven her mother to an early grave with grief. She was just one woman, 22 years old and alone in a world that chewed up and spit out people like her every single day. The footsteps grew closer, and she could hear the man's breathing now, heavy and eager. She thought about her father's face the last time she had seen him alive, bruised and bloodied after Blackwell's men had beaten him for refusing to sell his land. She thought about the promise she had made at his grave that she would make them pay, that she would see justice done even if it killed her. It looked like it was going to kill her. "I said come out," the gunman growled, his patience wearing thin. Harper opened her eyes and saw a crack in the fence, a gap between two boards just wide enough to see through. On the other side was another alley, and beyond that, she could make out the shape of a stable, horses moving in their stalls. If she could somehow get through, if she could run just a little farther, maybe she could steal a horse and ride out of town before they caught her. It was a desperate plan, probably a stupid plan, but it was all she had. She turned and started kicking at the boards near the crack, using all her strength to try to widen the gap. The wood was old and dry, and after a few kicks, one of the boards splintered. She kicked again, harder, and the board broke free with a crack that sounded impossibly loud in the confined space. "What the hell are you doing?" the gunman shouted, and she heard him start to run. Harper didn't wait to see if he would reach her. She threw herself at the gap, squeezing through the broken fence with a violence that tore her dress and scraped her skin raw. She tumbled through to the other side and scrambled to her feet, already running before she had fully regained her balance. The stable was closer than she had thought. just a dozen yards away, and she could smell the horses now, the familiar scent of hay and leather and animal warmth. She burst through the open stable door and looked around wildly, searching for a horse that was saddled and ready to ride. There were 6 stalls, and 5 of them held horses, but none of them were saddled. Harper cursed under her breath and grabbed a bridle hanging on the wall, moving toward the nearest horse, a chestnut mare with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. "Easy, girl," Harper whispered, her hand still shaking as she tried to slip the bridle over the mare's head. "We're going to get out of here, you and me. We're going to run so far they'll never find us." The mare stood still, accepting the bridle with the patience of an animal who had been through this process 1,000 times before. Harper was reaching for the stable door to open the stall when she heard a voice behind her, low and measured and utterly calm. "That's my horse." Harper spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. In the doorway of the stable stood a man she had never seen before, tall and lean with broad shoulders, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under the open sky. He wore dusty range clothes, a faded blue shirt and worn denim pants, and his hat was pushed back on his head to reveal dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster tied down in the way of a man who knew how to use it, but his hands were empty, resting at his sides in a posture that was somehow both relaxed and ready. "I need to borrow her," Harper said, her voice coming out higher and thinner than she intended. "Just for a few hours. I'll bring her back, I swear." The man's eyes moved from her face to the torn dress, the scratches on her arms, the satchel clutched tight against her chest. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his gaze, a sharpening of attention that made her feel suddenly visible in a way she hadn't been in months. "You running from someone?" he asked. "That's none of your business," Harper said, turning back to the stall. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy with haste. "Just let me take the horse. I'll send her back with someone, I promise." "Can't do that," the man said, and she heard him take a step forward. "Like I said, she's my horse, cost me 3 months' wages, and she's the best I've ever owned. I'm not letting a stranger steal her, no matter how desperate you look." Harper felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the helpless fury of someone who had fought so hard and come so close only to fail at the last moment. "Please," she said, hating the begging note in her voice. "They're going to kill me. I just need a horse, any horse. I'll pay you back. I'll send you money as soon as I can. Just please let me go." The man was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Harper heard the sound she had been dreading. Footsteps approaching the stable, more than one set now, and voices calling out to each other. She went this way, checked the stable, Harper's breath caught in her chest. She looked at the man, at his impassive face and steady eyes, and knew that he was going to hand her over. Why wouldn't he? She was nothing to him, just a stranger trying to steal his horse, and the men hunting her probably had money to offer, a reward for her capture. "All right," the man said suddenly, his voice still calm. "Get in the stall, close the door, and stay quiet." Harper stared at him, not understanding. "What? You heard me," he said, moving past her to the mare's stall. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter. "Get in there and don't make a sound. And for God's sake, keep your head down." Harper didn't stop to question or argue. She darted into the stall, pressing herself into the corner farthest from the door, behind the mare's large body. The man closed the stall door with a soft click and then moved away, and she heard him start to whistle, a tuneless melody that sounded careless and unconcerned. The footsteps reached the stable entrance, and Harper held her breath, her heart pounding so loud she was sure they would hear it. "You there," a voice said, and Harper recognized it as the gunman who had been chasing her. You see a woman come through here. Dark hair, green dress, carrying a satchel. Can't say I have, the man said, and his voice was so relaxed, so entirely without tension, that Harper almost believed him herself. Been in here tending to my horses for the last hour. Hasn't been anyone else around. You sure about that? Another voice asked, suspicious. We tracked her right to this area. She has to be here somewhere. Well, she's not in my stable, the man said, and now there was an edge to his voice, a subtle warning. You're welcome to look around if you don't believe me, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't spook my animals. They're high-strung. There was a pause, and Harper could imagine the gunmen exchanging glances, trying to decide whether to push the issue. She squeezed her eyes shut and prayed silently, desperately, to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Fine, the first gunman said finally. But if you see her, you let us know. There's $50 in it for anyone who helps us find her. I'll keep that in mind, the man said. The footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Harper waited, counting her heartbeats, not daring to move or breathe normally until the man came back to the stall and opened the door. They're gone, he said. For now. Harper stepped out of the stall on legs that felt like water, her entire body trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. She looked up at the man, at his face that revealed nothing of what he was thinking, and tried to find words adequate to express her gratitude. Thank you, she managed finally. I don't know why you helped me, but thank you. The man studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. What's your name? He asked. Harper, she said, then hesitated. Harper Ashford, Fletcher Young, he said, nodding slightly. And I helped you because you looked like you needed it. Also because I don't much care for men who make their living hunting other people. They're going to keep looking for me, Harper said. I can't stay in Durango. I need to get out of town, find somewhere safe to hide until I can figure out what to do with this. She lifted the satchel slightly. Fletcher's gaze dropped to the satchel, then back to her face. What's in there that's worth killing over? Harper hesitated again, her instinct for self-preservation warring with her sense that this man had earned at least part of the truth. Papers, she said finally. Evidence of fraud and murder. The man who owns most of the land around here, his name is Blackwell. He's been forcing ranchers to sell, using violence and intimidation. He killed my father. The papers prove it. They show the false deeds and the forged documents and the bribes he paid to keep the law from investigating. Fletcher's expression shifted slightly, a tightening around his eyes that suggested recognition. Thomas Blackwell. You know him. I know of him, Fletcher said, his voice harder now. He tried to buy my family's ranch 5 years ago. When my father refused to sell, Blackwell's men burned down our barn and killed 20 head of cattle. We couldn't prove it was him, but we knew. Harper felt a flicker of kinship with this stranger, a shared understanding born of similar grief. Then you know why I can't let him get away with it. These papers are the only evidence that exists. If I can get them to a territorial judge, someone outside of Blackwell's influence, I can stop him. Fletcher was quiet, his gaze distant, as though he was looking at something far away. Then he focused on her again and nodded once, decisively. All right, I'll help you. What? Harper said, startled. I'll help you get out of town and find someone who'll listen, Fletcher said. But we need to move now before those men come back with reinforcements. Can you ride? Yes, Harper said, still trying to process what was happening. But why would you do this? You don't know me. This isn't your fight. Fletcher moved to another stall and began saddling a large black gelding with efficient, practiced movements. Maybe I'm making it my fight, he said. Maybe I'm tired of watching men like Blackwell destroy good people and get away with it. Or maybe I just don't like seeing a woman chase through the streets like a criminal when the real criminals are the ones doing the chasing. He finished with the gelding and moved to the mare's stall, saddling her with the same quick competence. Harper watched him work, this cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere and offered help without asking for anything in return, and felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and despair that had been choking her for days. "I don't have money to pay you," she said quietly. Fletcher glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something like amusement in his eyes. "Did I ask for money?" "No, but then stop worrying about it," he said. He led both horses out of their stalls and handed her the mare's reins. "This is Rosie. She's steady and she's fast when you need her to be. You treat her right and she'll take care of you." Harper took the reins, her fingers brushing against his for a moment, and felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with fear or danger. She looked up at him, at the strong lines of his face and the quiet steadiness in his eyes, and wondered who this man was, what had shaped him into someone who would risk his own safety for a stranger's cause. "We'll head north," Fletcher said, swinging up onto the gelding with an easy grace. "There's a trail through the mountains that'll get us away from the main roads. It's rough going, but it'll be harder for them to track us." Harper mounted Rosie, settling into the saddle with a familiarity born of years of ranch life. Despite everything, despite the fear and the exhaustion and the overwhelming uncertainty of what lay ahead, she felt a small spark of hope kindle in her chest. They rode out of the stable together, keeping to the back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare where Blackwell's men would be watching. The sun was lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air had begun to cool with the approach of evening. Fletcher led the way with the confidence of someone who knew the land intimately, and Harper followed, trusting him because she had no other choice, and because something in her gut told her that this trust was not misplaced. They reached the edge of town without incident and struck out across the open grassland that stretched toward the mountains. The peaks rose in the distance, purple and imposing against the darkening sky, and Harper felt the first real breath of freedom she had known in months. Behind them, Durango grew smaller, its buildings and streets fading into insignificance, and with every stride of the horses, she felt the weight of her pursuers diminish. They rode in silence for the first hour, both of them focused on putting distance between themselves and the town. Fletcher set a steady pace, not so fast that it would exhaust the horses, but fast enough that they covered ground quickly. Harper found herself watching him as they rode, studying the easy way he sat in the saddle, the unconscious skill with which he guided his mount over rough terrain. He belonged out here, she realized, in this wild country where survival depended on strength and resourcefulness, and the ability to make quick decisions in the face of danger. When the sun finally set, and the stars began to emerge, Fletcher slowed his horse and looked back at her. "There's a place up ahead where we can make camp for the night," he said. "It's sheltered and there's water. We'll rest a few hours and then move on before dawn." Harper nodded, too tired to do more than agree. Her body ached from the riding and from the earlier violence of her escape, and she could feel exhaustion pulling at her like a heavy weight. They rode another half hour before Fletcher turned off the trail and led them into a small canyon where a creek ran between high rock walls. There were cottonwood trees growing along the water's edge, their leaves whispering in the night breeze, and the air smelled of sage and pine. Fletcher dismounted and began unsaddling his horse, and Harper did the same, her movements slow and clumsy with fatigue. When the horses were tended to and hobbled near the creek where they could drink and graze, Fletcher built a small fire, using dry wood that produced minimal smoke. The flames cast flickering shadows across the canyon walls, and Harper sat down on a flat rock near the fire, finally allowing herself to relax. Fletcher pulled food from his saddlebags, jerky and hardtack and a tin of peaches, and they ate in silence, the simple meal tasting better than anything Harper had eaten in recent memory. When they were finished, Fletcher leaned back against a boulder and looked at her across the fire, his face half in shadow. "Tell me about your father," he said. Harper hadn't expected the question, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. Then the words started coming, haltingly at first and then faster, the story pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. She told him about the ranch where she had grown up, about her father who had been kind and honest and too trusting for his own good. She told him about how Blackwell had started buying up land in the territory, how he had made increasingly aggressive offers to purchase her father's ranch, and how her father had refused because the land had been in their family for 2 generations and was meant to be passed down to her. She told him about the day the men had come, how they had beaten her father and threatened to do worse if he didn't sign the deed over to Blackwell. She told him about how her father had held firm, had sent her away to stay with friends in town for her own safety, and how she had received word 3 days later that he was dead, killed in what the sheriff had called a tragic accident, but what she knew had been murder. "My mother died 6 months after that," Harper said, her voice rough with suppressed emotion. "The grief killed her, or maybe she just didn't want to live anymore without him. I inherited the ranch, what was left of it, but Blackwell contested the inheritance in court. He had lawyers and judges in his pocket, and I had nothing. They took everything." "How did you get those papers?" Fletcher asked quietly. Harper looked down at the satchel sitting beside her on the rock. "I got a job working as a secretary in Blackwell's office. I pretended to be someone else, used a different name, made myself useful so he wouldn't look at me too closely. I spent 3 months copying documents, taking notes, gathering evidence. Then yesterday I took everything I had collected and ran." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "That took courage," he said finally. "It took desperation," Harper corrected. "I was so angry, so broken by everything that had happened, I didn't care what it cost me. I just wanted him to pay. I wanted everyone to know what kind of man he really is." "You're not broken," Fletcher said, and there was something in his voice, a gentleness that made Harper's breath catch. "Yes, I am," she said, and she felt the tears she had been holding back start to well up. "Everything I had, everyone I loved, it's all gone. I'm alone in the world and I'm running for my life, and even if I somehow manage to get these papers to someone who can use them, it won't bring my parents back. It won't fix anything. I'm broken, Fletcher. I'm broken beyond any repair." Fletcher stood up and moved around the fire, sitting down beside her on the rock. He didn't touch her, but his presence was solid and warm, a steadying force in the darkness. "You know what I learned working on ranches all these years," he said. "Broken things fit together best. A fence with some worn spots, you patch it with other worn wood, and it holds stronger than new. A saddle that's been used hard, you fix it with leather that's been through the same, and it lasts longer than one straight from the tanner. People are the same way. The ones who have been broken and put themselves back together, they understand things that whole people never will." Harper turned to look at him, her vision blurred with tears. "You think I can put myself back together?" "I think you already are," Fletcher said. "You're still fighting, aren't you? Still trying to make things right. That's not broken, that's strong." A tear slid down Harper's cheek and she didn't bother to wipe it away. "Why are you helping me?" she asked again. "Really?" Fletcher was quiet, his gaze steady on her face. "I told you about my family's ranch," he said. "What I didn't tell you was that we lost it anyway, 2 years after the barn burning. My father took loans he couldn't pay back, trying to rebuild, and the bank foreclosed. He died of a heart attack a month later. My mother went to live with her sister in Kansas, and I've been drifting ever since, working whatever jobs I could find, trying to figure out what to do with myself. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more intense. I'm helping you because I wish someone had helped my father. Because I know what it's like to watch someone you love destroyed by men who think their money makes them untouchable. And because when I saw you in that stable, so scared and determined all at once, I saw someone worth fighting for. Harper felt something crack open inside her, a fissure in the wall she had built around her heart to protect herself from more pain. She looked at Fletcher, at this cowboy who had risked everything for a stranger, and felt the first stirring of something she had thought she would never feel again, something that felt dangerous and terrifying and absolutely necessary. "Thank you," she whispered. Fletcher nodded, then stood up and moved back to his side of the fire. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch for a while, make sure we're not followed." Harper lay down on her bedroll, her body grateful for the rest even as her mind continued to race. She watched Fletcher across the fire, watched the way the flames lit his profile, strong and patient and unutterably kind, and felt something shift in her understanding of the world. Maybe she was broken. Maybe she would always carry the scars of what had happened to her family. But maybe Fletcher was right. Maybe broken things could fit together in ways that made them stronger than they had ever been alone. She fell asleep with that thought, and for the first time in months, her dreams were not filled with nightmares. When she woke, the sky was still dark, but there was a faint lightening on the eastern horizon that promised dawn. Fletcher was crouched by the fire, which he had let burn down to embers, and he was saddling the horses with quiet efficiency. "Time to move," he said when he saw her stirring. "I want to be well into the mountains before full light." They broke camp quickly, leaving no trace of their presence, and rode out as the first rays of sun touched the peaks above them. The trail Fletcher chose was narrow and steep, winding through stands of pine and aspen, and Harper had to focus all her attention on guiding Rosie over the treacherous ground. The higher they climbed, the cooler the air became, and she was grateful for the shawl she had tucked into her satchel. They rode for hours, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and drink from mountain streams that ran cold and clear. Fletcher rarely spoke, but his presence was constant and reassuring, and Harper found herself growing more comfortable with the silence. There was something peaceful about it, she realized, something that felt like trust. It was midday when they finally stopped for a longer rest in a meadow surrounded by towering pines. Fletcher dismounted and helped Harper down from Rosie, his hands strong and steady on her waist, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the scent of leather and horses and something uniquely his own. "How far have we come?" she asked, stepping back reluctantly. "Maybe 20 miles from Durango," Fletcher said. "We're still in Colorado territory, but we're heading toward the New Mexico border. There's a town called Aztec about 2 days' ride from here. It's small, but there's a marshal there I've heard is honest. We can try him first, see if he'll take your evidence seriously." Harper nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "And if he won't, then we keep going until we find someone who will," Fletcher said simply. They ate a quick meal of the remaining jerky and some wild berries that Fletcher picked from bushes at the edge of the meadow. Harper watched him as he moved through the trees, his eyes scanning the ground for edible plants with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime living off the land. And she felt a growing admiration for his competence and self-sufficiency. "You know a lot about surviving out here," she said when he returned with a handful of berries. "Had to learn," Fletcher said, sitting down beside her. After my family lost the ranch, I worked as a drover for a while, helping move cattle from Texas to Kansas. You spend months on the trail, you figure out pretty quick what you can eat and what'll kill you. Do you miss it? Harper asked. The ranch, I mean. Fletcher's expression grew distant. Every day. There's something about having your own land, your own place in the world, that makes everything else feel temporary. I've been saving money, hoping to buy some property somewhere, start over. But good land is expensive, and men like Blackwell keep buying it all up before honest folks can get a chance. I'm sorry, Harper said softly. Not your fault, Fletcher said. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. Maybe between the two of us, we can make sure at least one piece of land gets back to where it belongs. You mean my family's ranch? Harper said, surprised. If we can take Blackwell down, if your evidence is as solid as you say it is, then all his illegal land acquisitions should be reversed. You might get your ranch back. The possibility hadn't occurred to Harper, and for a moment she let herself imagine it, returning to the land where she had grown up, rebuilding what had been destroyed. But the image that came to mind wasn't of her standing alone on the porch of the old house. It was of her standing there with Fletcher beside her, the two of them watching the sun set over the hills together. The thought should have frightened her, should have seemed too fast and too presumptuous, but instead, it felt right in a way that nothing else had in a very long time. They stayed in the meadow for another hour, letting the horses rest and graze, and then they continued their journey. The trail grew rougher as they climbed higher, the trees thinning out until they were riding across bare rock with vast drops on either side. Harper tried not to look down at the canyons below, focusing instead on Rosie's steady steps and on Fletcher's broad back ahead of her. By the time they made camp that night, Harper was exhausted, every muscle in her body aching from the long day in the saddle. Fletcher found them another sheltered spot, this time a small cave that offered protection from the wind that had begun to blow down from the peaks. He built a fire near the cave entrance and then disappeared into the twilight with his rifle, returning half an hour later with 2 rabbits. Figured we could use some fresh meat, he said, setting to work cleaning and skinning the animals with a skill that spoke of long practice. Harper watched him prepare the rabbits and set them to roasting over the fire, the smell of cooking meat making her stomach growl with hunger. When the food was ready, they ate with their fingers, the meat tender and flavorful, and Harper couldn't remember the last time anything had tasted so good. "You're good at this," she said, licking grease from her fingers. "Taking care of things, I mean. Making sure there's food and shelter and everything we need." Fletcher shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "Just doing what needs to be done." "It's more than that," Harper insisted. "You make it look easy, but I know it's not. You're good at reading the land, at knowing what's safe and what's dangerous. You're good at making decisions quickly. Those are rare skills." "So are yours," Fletcher said, meeting her eyes across the fire. "The way you planned and executed that theft from Blackwell's office, the way you've kept going even when you're scared and tired, that takes guts and intelligence. You sell yourself short, Harper." She felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "I don't feel very smart or brave right now. Mostly I just feel lucky that you showed up when you did." "I feel lucky too," Fletcher said quietly, and the way he was looking at her made her pulse quicken. The silence stretched between them, charged with an awareness that was both thrilling and terrifying. Harper knew she should look away, should break the moment before it became something more, but she couldn't seem to make herself move. Fletcher's eyes were like storm clouds, deep and intense, and she felt as though she could fall into them and never find her way out. Finally, Fletcher cleared his throat and looked away, breaking the spell. "You should get some sleep," Tomorrow's going to be another long day." Harper nodded, though sleep suddenly felt like the last thing she wanted. She spread her bedroll on the cave floor and lay down, pulling her shawl over herself like a blanket. The fire crackled and popped, and beyond the cave entrance, she could hear the wind singing through the rocks, a lonely sound that somehow felt less lonely because Fletcher was there. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, it was deep night and the fire had burned down to coals. She opened her eyes and saw Fletcher sitting near the cave entrance, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch. The moonlight silvered his profile, and she studied him in the darkness, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was praying. "Fletcher," she said softly. He turned, surprised. "Did I wake you?" "No," Harper said, sitting up. "I just woke up. Can't you sleep?" "I will in a bit," he said. "Wanted to make sure we're safe first." Harper stood up and moved to sit beside him at the cave entrance. The night was clear and cold, the stars spread out above them in a vast glittering canopy. "You think they're still following us?" she asked. "Probably," Fletcher said. "Men like that don't give up easy, especially when there's money involved. But we've got a good lead, and the trail we're taking isn't one most people know about. We should be all right." "Should be," Harper repeated. "But you're not certain." "Nothing's certain out here," Fletcher said. "That's why you stay alert, keep your guard up. It's the only way to survive." Harper was quiet for a moment, looking out at the vast darkness of the mountains. "Is that how you've been living? Always on guard, never letting yourself rest?" Fletcher glanced at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression, something he usually kept hidden. "I guess so. It's been a long time since I felt like I could let my guard down." "That sounds exhausting," Harper said softly. "It is," Fletcher admitted, "but it's kept me alive." Harper reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm and rough with calluses, the hand of a man who worked hard for everything he had. "You don't have to keep it up all the time, you know. Not with me. I'm not going to hurt you." Fletcher looked down at her hand on his, and then he turned his palm up, lacing his fingers through hers. The gesture was simple, almost innocent, but it felt profound, a connection that went deeper than words. "I know," he said. "That's what scares me." Harper's breath caught. "Why does that scare you?" Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Because I haven't let myself care about anyone in a long time. It's easier that way, safer. But with you, I don't seem to have a choice. I care, and it's terrifying because I know how much it hurts to lose someone you care about." Harper felt tears prick at her eyes again, but this time they were different, not tears of grief or fear but of something softer, something that felt like hope and healing all mixed together. "I'm scared too," she whispered. "I told you I was broken, and I meant it. I don't know if I have anything left to give someone else, but when I'm with you, I feel like maybe I could try." Fletcher turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight, his eyes were impossibly tender. "You're not broken, Harper. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. And if you are broken, well, like I said, broken things fit together best. Maybe we can be broken together, and maybe that'll be enough." Harper felt something inside her chest unfold, like a flower opening to the sun after a long winter. She leaned forward, hardly aware that she was moving, and Fletcher met her halfway. Their lips touched, a gentle brush that sent electricity racing through her entire body. The kiss was careful at first, tentative, as though they were both afraid of pushing too hard and shattering the fragile thing growing between them. But then Fletcher's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek, and the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent and necessary. Harper felt years of grief and pain and loneliness pour out of her, and in their place, something new and fierce and beautiful took root. She clutched at Fletcher's shirt, anchoring herself to him, and he pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her as though he could protect her from everything that had ever hurt her. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, Harper rested her forehead against his. "This is crazy," she whispered. "We barely know each other." "I know," Fletcher said, his voice rough, "but it doesn't feel crazy. It feels like the first sane thing that's happened to me in years." Harper laughed, the sound shaky but genuine. "I feel the same way." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the stars wheel slowly across the sky. Eventually, the cold drove them back into the cave, and they lay down together on Harper's bedroll, Fletcher's arms still around her, her head pillowed on his chest. Harper listened to the steady beat of his heart and felt safer than she had since her father died. "Tell me about your dreams," Fletcher said into the darkness. "The things you wanted before all this happened." Harper thought about it, reaching back to a time when her life had been simple and full of possibility. "I wanted to run the ranch," she said. "I wanted to raise horses, the really good kind that people come from miles around to buy. My father always said I had a gift with horses, that I could gentle the wildest colt just by talking to it. I wanted to build something that would last, something I could pass down to my own children someday." "You still can," Fletcher said. "Once we stop Blackwell, once you get your land back, you can build all of that." "What about you?" Harper asked. "What are your dreams?" Fletcher was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I used to dream about having my own ranch, my own piece of land where I could build a life. But lately, I've been dreaming about something more than that. I've been dreaming about having someone to share it with, someone who understands what it means to fight for something worth keeping. Someone like you." Harper's throat tightened with emotion. She turned her head to look up at him, and even in the darkness, she could see the sincerity in his face. "Fletcher, we just met yesterday." "I know," he said. "But sometimes you just know, don't you? Sometimes you meet someone and everything just clicks into place, like you've been waiting your whole life without realizing it, and suddenly they're there and everything makes sense." Harper knew exactly what he meant because she felt it too, this sense of rightness of coming home after a long journey. "Yes," she whispered. "Sometimes you just know." Fletcher kissed her again, slow and sweet, and then he settled her more comfortably against his chest. "Sleep," he murmured. "I've got you. You're safe." And for the first time in a year, Harper believed it. They set out again before dawn, riding through the cold mountain air as the sky slowly lightened from black to gray to pale blue. The trail descended now, leading them down out of the high peaks and into a valley where a river ran swift and cold between banks lined with willows. They followed the river for several hours, and gradually the landscape began to change, becoming drier and more open, the mountains falling away behind them. By mid-afternoon, they reached the outskirts of Aztec, a small town built along the river with maybe 50 buildings clustered together like a handful of dice thrown onto the earth. It was smaller than Durango, quieter, and Harper felt a flutter of nervousness as they rode down the main street. What if the marshal here was like the sheriff in Durango, bought and paid for by men like Blackwell? What if they had come all this way for nothing? Fletcher seemed to sense her anxiety because he reached over and squeezed her hand briefly. "It's going to be all right," he said. "We'll take it one step at a time." They found the marshal's office near the center of town, a small building with barred windows and a sign that read Marshal John Reed, New Mexico Territory. Fletcher helped Harper dismount, and together they walked up the steps and through the door. Inside, a man sat at a desk covered with papers and wanted posters. He was in his 50s, Harper guessed, with gray hair and a weathered face that bore the marks of years spent dealing with the rougher elements of frontier life. He looked up as they entered, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Help you folks?" he asked. Fletcher removed his hat. "Marshal Reed, my name is Fletcher Young and this is Harper Ashford. We need to speak with you about a matter of some urgency." Reed leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving from Fletcher to Harper and back again. "What kind of matter?" Harper stepped forward, clutching the satchel against her chest. "I have evidence of fraud and murder committed by Thomas Blackwell of Durango, Colorado. He's been illegally acquiring land through violence and intimidation, and he's had people killed to cover his tracks. My father was one of them." Reed's expression didn't change, but Harper saw something shift in his eyes, a sharpening of interest. "That's a serious accusation." "I know," Harper said, "but I can prove it. I have documents, forged deeds, records of bribes paid to officials, everything. I worked in his office for 3 months gathering evidence." Reed stood up and walked around the desk, holding out his hand. "Let me see." Harper hesitated, her fingers tightening on the satchel. This was it, the moment she had been working toward, and suddenly she was terrified. What if Reed didn't believe her? What if he took the papers and then destroyed them? Fletcher moved closer, his presence a solid reassurance at her back. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Show him." Harper opened the satchel and pulled out the sheaf of papers, handing them to Reed. The marshal took them to the window where the light was better and began reading, his expression growing grimmer with each page. He spent a long time going through the documents, occasionally making a small sound of surprise or disgust, and Harper stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, Reed looked up and his face was set in hard lines. "This is explosive," he said. "If even half of this is true, Blackwell should hang." "It's all true," Harper said. "Every word. I copied it directly from his files." Reed looked at her and she saw respect in his eyes. "You've got courage, Miss Ashford. Coming forward with this took guts." He turned to Fletcher. "And you are a friend," Fletcher said simply. "Someone who believes Miss Ashford deserves justice." Reed nodded slowly, then looked back at the papers in his hands. "This is beyond my jurisdiction. Blackwell operates in Colorado, and I'm a New Mexico marshal. But I know someone who can help. Judge Samuel Harrison is the territorial judge for the Colorado district. He's based out of Santa Fe, and he's known for being incorruptible. If anyone can take Blackwell down, it's him." "How far is Santa Fe?" Fletcher asked. "About 150 miles south," Reed said. 4, maybe 5 days' ride depending on the weather and the trail you take." Harper felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. They still had so far to go, but at least now there was a clear path forward. "Will you help us?" she asked Reed. "Can you get us to Judge Harrison?" Reed was quiet for a moment, studying the papers again. Then he looked up and nodded. "I'll do better than that. I'll come with you to Santa Fe and present these papers to the judge myself. That way there's an official officer of the law vouching for their authenticity. It'll carry more weight." "Thank you," Harper said, and she felt tears threaten again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. Reed smiled, the expression softening his stern features. "Don't thank me yet. We still have to get to Santa Fe, and you can bet that once Blackwell realizes what you've done, he's going to send every gun he can hire after you. This isn't over, Miss Ashford. It's just beginning." They spent the night in Aztec, Reed arranging rooms for them at the town's small boarding house, while he made preparations for the journey to Santa Fe. Harper found herself in a small but clean room with a real bed and a wash basin. And after days of sleeping on the ground, it felt like the height of luxury. She washed the trail dust from her face and hands and then sat on the bed, finally allowing herself to process everything that had happened over the past 2 days. 2 days ago, she had been running for her life, certain that she was going to die in some dusty alley in Durango. Now she had a marshal willing to help her, a real chance at justice, and Fletcher, just thinking his name made her heart beat faster. She couldn't explain what had happened between them, couldn't rationalize the intensity of her feelings for a man she had known for such a short time. But she didn't need to explain it or rationalize it. She just needed to accept it, this strange and wonderful thing that had grown between them like a wildflower pushing up through rock. There was a soft knock on her door, and when she opened it, Fletcher was standing there, his hat in his hands, looking uncertain in a way she had never seen before. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "You're not," Harper said, stepping back to let him in. "Come in." Fletcher entered the room and Harper closed the door behind him. For a moment they just stood there, looking at each other, and the air between them felt electric with possibility. "I wanted to check on you," Fletcher said. "Make sure you're all right." "I'm all right," Harper said. "Better than all right, actually. We're going to do this, Fletcher. We're going to stop Blackwell." "We are," Fletcher agreed. "But that's not really why I came here." Harper's breath caught. "Why did you come?" Fletcher took a step closer, and then another, until they were standing close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I came because I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice low and intense. "I came because every minute I'm not with you feels wrong somehow, like I'm missing something essential. I came because I'm falling in love with you, Harper Ashford, and I needed you to know that before we ride into whatever danger is waiting for us in Santa Fe." Harper felt her eyes fill with tears, but this time she didn't try to hide them. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I could feel this way again, not after everything I've lost. But you make me believe that maybe I can have a future, that maybe I can be happy again." Fletcher cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You can," he said fiercely. "You can have everything you want, Harper. A future, happiness, a home, family, all of it. And if you'll let me, I want to be part of that. I want to build it with you." Harper reached up and covered his hands with hers, pressing them more firmly against her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it. Yes to you." Fletcher kissed her then, and it was different from the kisses they had shared before. This kiss was a promise, a commitment, a declaration of intent. Harper kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her hope and fear and love into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both of them were shaking. "I should go," Fletcher said, though he made no move to leave. "Let you rest." "Stay," Harper said, surprising herself. "Just stay with me tonight. I don't want to be alone." Fletcher searched her face, and whatever he saw there must have convinced him because he nodded. They lay down on the bed together, fully clothed, Harper curled into Fletcher's side with his arm around her. They talked in whispers as the night deepened outside the window, sharing stories from their childhoods, their dreams and fears, the little details that made up a life. Harper told him about her mother's laugh, the way her father used to sing while he worked, the smell of bread baking in their kitchen. Fletcher told her about learning to rope cattle, about the first horse he ever owned, about the way the stars looked from the porch of his family's ranch. They talked until Harper's voice grew heavy with sleep. And then they simply held each other, the comfort of human warmth and connection, chasing away the loneliness that had haunted them both for so long. When Harper woke the next morning, Fletcher was already up, standing by the window and looking out at the street below. The early morning light painted him in shades of gold, and Harper took a moment to just look at him, to memorize the lines of his body and the way he stood, solid and certain even in the face of uncertainty. "Morning," she said softly. Fletcher turned and smiled, and the warmth in his eyes made her heart flutter. "Morning, how'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in a year," Harper said truthfully. "How about you, same," Fletcher said. He came back to the bed and sat down beside her, taking her hand. "Reed wants to leave within the hour. Are you ready?" Harper squeezed his hand. "As ready as I'll ever be." They met Reed in front of the boarding house, where he was waiting with 3 horses already saddled and provisioned for the journey. The marshal had changed into trail clothes and wore his gun belt strapped low, a Winchester rifle in a scabbard on his saddle. He looked every inch the lawman, capable and dangerous, and Harper felt a surge of confidence in their mission. "We'll take the main road south for the first day," Reed said as they mounted up. "After that, we'll cut east toward the Chama River and follow it down to Santa Fe. It's the fastest route, but it's also the most exposed. We'll need to stay alert." They rode out of Aztec as the sun rose, the 3 of them forming a small but determined group. The land they traveled through was beautiful in a harsh way, all red rock and sparse vegetation, vast open spaces where you could see for miles in every direction. It was the kind of landscape that made Harper feel both very small and very alive, aware of her own insignificance in the face of such immensity and grateful to be part of it nonetheless. They made good time that first day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat. Reed proved to be good company, with a dry sense of humor and a wealth of stories from his years as a lawman. He told them about chasing outlaws through the Badlands, about gunfights in dusty streets, about the strange and wonderful and terrible things he had seen in his time keeping the peace on the frontier. "Most folks think being a marshal is all excitement and gunplay," he said as they sat around the campfire that night. "But mostly it's just paperwork and dealing with drunks and trying to keep people from killing each other over petty disputes. The real danger comes from men like Blackwell, the ones who think the law doesn't apply to them because they've got money and influence. Those are the ones who make this job hard." "Will Judge Harrison really be able to stop him?" Harper asked. "Blackwell has so much power." "Harrison is tough," Reed said. "He sent more than one powerful man to prison, and he's never been afraid to stand up to political pressure. If your evidence is as solid as it looks, Blackwell won't be able to buy his way out of it." "I hope you're right," Harper said quietly. "Me too," Reed said, and there was a gravity in his voice that made Harper realize just how much he was risking by helping them. The next 2 days passed without incident, the 3 of them falling into an easy rhythm of riding and camping and moving ever southward. Harper found herself relaxing despite the danger, enjoying the journey and the company. Fletcher was always near, always attentive, and she found comfort in his presence. They would ride side by side when the trail allowed it, talking about everything and nothing. And at night they would find ways to be alone together, stealing kisses in the darkness while Reed kept a diplomatic distance. It was on the 4th day, as they were following the Chama River through a narrow canyon, that everything went wrong. They were riding single file, Reed in the lead and Harper in the middle, when the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the rock wall beside Reed's head, sending up a spray of stone chips, and the marshal reacted instantly, yanking his horse around and shouting for them to take cover. Harper didn't think, just acted, spurring Rosie forward toward a cluster of boulders on the canyon floor. Fletcher was right behind her, and they both threw themselves from their saddles, using the rocks as shelter. More shots followed, the reports echoing off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell how many shooters there were or where they were positioned. "Stay down," Fletcher said, drawing his pistol and peering around the edge of the boulder. Reed had dismounted as well and was crouched behind another rock formation, his rifle in his hands. "I count at least 3 of them," he called out. "Up on the rim, east side." Harper's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She fumbled for the small pistol she had been carrying in her satchel, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. "You know how to use that?" Fletcher asked, nodding at the gun. "My father taught me," Harper said, though in truth, she had only fired it a handful of times and never at a living target. More shots rang out, and one of them struck the boulder where they were hiding, sending rock splinters flying. Fletcher returned fire, his movements calm and controlled, and Harper heard a cry of pain from above, suggesting he had hit one of their attackers. The firefight continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Reed and Fletcher worked together with the coordination of experienced fighters, taking turns providing covering fire while the other moved to a better position. Harper stayed low, her pistol ready but unused, her mind racing with fear and adrenaline. Finally, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was eerie and oppressive, broken only by the sound of the river and their own harsh breathing. "You think they're gone," Harper whispered. "Or they're reloading," Fletcher said grimly. "Reed, I'm going to circle around," the marshal called back. "Try to flank them. You two stay here and keep your heads down." Before either of them could protest, Reed was moving, using the rocks and terrain for cover as he worked his way toward the canyon wall. Harper watched him go, her stomach tight with worry. What if there were more shooters than they thought? What if Reed was walking into an ambush? Minutes passed like hours, and then they heard more gunfire, distant and echoing. Fletcher tensed, his pistol raised and ready, and Harper gripped her own gun so tight her knuckles went white. Then there was silence again, absolute and terrifying. "Reed." Fletcher called out, no response. "Reed," still nothing. Fletcher cursed under his breath and looked at Harper. "I'm going after him. You stay here no matter what happens. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, you ride for Santa Fe as fast as you can and don't look back." "No," Harper said, grabbing his arm. "I'm not leaving you." "Harper," I said no, she said fiercely. "We're in this together. I'm not losing you." Fletcher looked at her, and she saw fear and love and determination all mixed together in his eyes. "All right," he said finally. "But you stay right behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run." "Understood." Harper nodded, not trusting her voice. They moved out from behind the boulders, Fletcher leading the way with his gun drawn, Harper following so close she was almost stepping on his heels. They worked their way toward the spot where they had last seen Reed, every sense on high alert, expecting bullets to start flying at any moment. They found Reed at the base of the canyon wall, standing over the bodies of 3 men. He was reloading his rifle, his face set in grim lines, and there was blood on his sleeve. "You're hurt," Harper said, rushing forward. Reed looked down at his arm as though noticing the injury for the first time. "Just a graze. I'll live." He nudged one of the bodies with his boot. "These are hired guns, the kind you can find in any saloon if you've got the money to pay them. Blackwell's work, no doubt." "How did they find us?" Fletcher asked. "Could be they've been tracking us since Durango," Reed said. "Or could be Blackwell has people watching the roads, waiting for someone matching your description to pass through. Either way, we need to assume he knows where we are and where we're headed." "What do we do?" Harper asked. Reed looked at her, and there was respect in his eyes. "We keep going. We're only a day's ride from Santa Fe now. We push hard, ride through the night if we have to, and get those papers to Judge Harrison before Blackwell can send more men after us." Fletcher nodded. "Let's move then." They collected the horses, which had scattered during the fight but hadn't gone far, and remounted. Reed set a punishing pace and they rode hard, pushing the animals to their limits. Harper clung to Rosie's mane, her body aching from the constant jarring, her mind numb with exhaustion and fear. But she didn't complain, didn't ask to slow down. She knew as well as the men did that their lives depended on reaching Santa Fe, They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, stopping only once to water the horses and catch their breath. When night fell, Reed didn't call for them to make camp. Instead, he produced a lantern from his saddlebag and lit it, and they continued riding by its wavering light, following the river as it wound through the darkness. Harper dozed in the saddle, jerking awake every time she started to slip sideways. Fletcher rode beside her, and more than once she felt his hand on her arm, steadying her, keeping her from falling. The night seemed endless, a dark tunnel through which they traveled without ever seeming to reach the other end. But eventually, impossibly, the sky began to lighten, and Reed pointed ahead to where a cluster of lights glowed in the distance. "Santa Fe," he said, and his voice was hoarse with fatigue. "We made it." They rode into the city as the sun rose, three exhausted riders on blown horses, covered in dust and sweat and dried blood. Santa Fe was bigger than either Durango or Aztec, a proper city with adobe buildings and a central plaza and streets that bustled with early morning activity. Reed led them straight to a large building near the plaza, a courthouse with the territorial seal emblazoned above its entrance. "Wait here," Reed said, dismounting stiffly. "I'll find Harrison." He disappeared inside, and Harper and Fletcher sat on their horses, too tired to dismount, too numb to feel anything beyond a dull gratitude that they had survived the night. Harper looked at Fletcher and saw her own exhaustion reflected in his face along with something deeper, a bone-deep weariness that came from too many hard miles and too much danger. "We did it," she said softly. "Not yet," Fletcher said. "Not until Harrison takes the case." But when Reed emerged from the courthouse 15 minutes later, he was smiling, a rare expression that transformed his stern features. "Harrison will see you now," he said. "He's already read through some of the papers I showed him, and he's furious. He wants to hear your story directly, Miss Ashford." Harper dismounted on shaking legs and followed Reed into the building, Fletcher right behind her. They were led through a series of corridors to a large office where an elderly man sat behind a massive desk. He had white hair and piercing blue eyes, and when he looked at Harper, she felt as though he was seeing straight into her soul. "Miss Ashford," Judge Harrison said, standing and extending his hand. "I'm told you've brought me evidence of serious crimes." Harper shook his hand, drawing strength from the firmness of his grip. "Yes, sir. Evidence against Thomas Blackwell of Durango, Colorado." "Sit down," Harrison said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. "Tell me everything." And so Harper did. She told the judge her story from beginning to end, leaving nothing out, describing her father's murder and her mother's death, and the months she had spent gathering evidence. She showed him the papers, explaining each document and what it proved, and Harrison listened with intense attention, occasionally asking questions but mostly just absorbing the information with the focus of a man who had spent his life judging right from wrong. When she finished, the office was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Harrison sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Ashford," he said finally, "what you've brought me is enough to put Thomas Blackwell in prison for the rest of his life, possibly to send him to the gallows. This is comprehensive, damning evidence of fraud, extortion, and murder. I commend your courage in bringing it forward." Harper felt tears well up, but she blinked them back. "What happens now?" "Now I issue warrants for Blackwell's arrest and the arrest of everyone else implicated in these documents," Harrison said. "I'll send federal marshals to Durango to execute the warrants and seize Blackwell's records. And I'll order a full investigation into every land transaction he's been involved with. The illegally acquired properties will be returned to their rightful owners." "My family's ranch?" Harper asked, hardly daring to hope. Harrison smiled, and it was a kind expression. "Your family's ranch will be returned to you, Miss Ashford, along with compensation for the years you were illegally deprived of it. It won't bring your parents back, but it's a start toward justice." Harper couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They flowed freely down her cheeks, years of grief and anger and loss pouring out in a cathartic release. Fletcher reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently, and she held on to him like an anchor in a storm. "Thank you," she managed to say through her tears. "Thank you so much." Harrison stood and came around the desk, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did this, Miss Ashford. You fought for justice when it would have been easier to give up. Your parents would be proud of you." The judge made arrangements for them to stay in Santa Fe while the warrants were executed, and the investigation proceeded, providing them with rooms at a respectable hotel and ensuring they had everything they needed. Over the next 2 weeks, Harper watched as Harrison's machinery of justice ground into motion. Federal marshals rode out to Durango, and reports filtered back of Blackwell's arrest and the seizure of his assets. Other names from Harper's documents were rounded up, officials and business associates who had been complicit in Blackwell's crimes. The territorial newspapers picked up the story, and suddenly Harper found herself at the center of attention. Journalists seeking interviews and ordinary citizens approaching her on the street to offer their support. It was overwhelming and exhausting, but Fletcher was always there, running interference when she needed space, standing beside her when she needed support. They spent their evenings walking through the streets of Santa Fe, exploring the old city with its mix of Spanish and American influences. They would find quiet spots in the plaza and sit together, watching the sunset paint the adobe buildings in shades of gold and orange, talking about their plans for the future. "I want to rebuild the ranch," Harper said one evening as they sat on a bench beneath an ancient cottonwood tree. "I want to make it what my father dreamed it could be, a place where we raise the best horses in the territory." "We," Fletcher said, and there was something hopeful in his voice. Harper turned to look at him, at this man who had risked everything to help her, who had become the most important person in her world in the span of a few short weeks. "Yes, we, if you want to, if you'll stay with me and help me build it." Fletcher took both her hands in his gray eyes intense and full of emotion. "Harper Ashford, there's nothing in this world I want more than to stay with you and build a life together. I love you, and I want to spend every day for the rest of my life proving it." "I love you too," Harper said, her voice breaking with the force of her feelings. "I thought I was broken beyond any repair, but you showed me that broken things can fit together and make something new and beautiful. You healed me, Fletcher." "You healed me too," Fletcher said softly. "I was drifting, lost, until I found you. You gave me a reason to stop running, a reason to put down roots and fight for something that matters." He kissed her then, there in the plaza with people walking past, and the sun setting behind the mountains, and Harper felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. When they broke apart, Fletcher reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, holding it out to her. It was a ring, simple and plain, just a band of silver with no adornment. "It's not much," Fletcher said, suddenly shy, "but I wanted to give you something, a symbol of my commitment. Will you marry me, Harper? Will you let me be your partner in all things for the rest of our lives?" Harper looked at the ring, at the earnest hope in Fletcher's face, and knew that this was the future she wanted, the life she was meant to have. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with certainty. "Yes, I'll marry you." Fletcher slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. They kissed again, and Harper felt complete in a way she had never felt before, whole despite all the ways she had been broken, strong because of the person who stood beside her. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with Judge Harrison officiating and Marshal Reed standing as witness. Harper wore a simple blue dress that Fletcher had bought for her, and Fletcher wore his best clothes, his dark hair combed back and his face shining with joy. The ceremony was brief and without frills, but it was perfect. Every word of the vows they exchanged filled with meaning and intention. When Harrison pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher kissed Harper with such tenderness that she felt tears slide down her cheeks for what seemed like the 1,000th time in recent weeks. But these were happy tears, tears of joy and promise and hope for the future. After the ceremony, they celebrated with a meal at Santa Fe's finest restaurant, the four of them, Harper and Fletcher and Reid and Harrison, sharing stories and laughter and toasting to justice and new beginnings. Harrison gave them a wedding gift, a copy of the court order returning the Ashford ranch to Harper's ownership, and Reid gave them a pair of matching rifles, practical and necessary for life on a frontier ranch. "You've both shown tremendous courage," Harrison said, raising his glass. "The world needs more people like you, people who stand up for what's right even when it's dangerous. I have no doubt you'll build something wonderful together." "Hear, hear," Reid said, clinking his glass against Harrison's. "To the Youngs, may your life together be long and full of happiness." Harper looked at Fletcher, at her husband, and felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. "To us," she said, "to broken things that fit together best." Fletcher smiled and kissed her hand. "To us." They left Santa Fe 2 days later, riding north toward Durango and the land that was now theirs again. The journey took a week, retracing the path they had traveled in such desperate haste only a month earlier, but this time there was no fear, no urgency. They traveled at an easy pace, stopping to camp in beautiful spots and spending long hours talking about their plans for the ranch. When they finally reached the Ashford property, Harper sat on Rosie's back and looked at the land where she had grown up, and her heart ached with bittersweet emotion. The house was still standing, though it needed repair. The barn had been partially rebuilt after Blackwell's men burned it, and the fields were overgrown with weeds. It would take work to restore the place to its former glory, years of labor and investment, but Harper wasn't daunted. She had Fletcher beside her, and together they could do anything. They spent the first few days cleaning out the house, making it habitable again. Fletcher repaired the broken windows and patched the roof, while Harper scrubbed floors and beat the dust from old rugs. They worked side by side, and Harper found joy in the simple domesticity of it, the act of building a home together. Neighbors began to stop by once word spread that Harper had returned and that Blackwell had been arrested. Some came to offer congratulations, others to apologize for not standing up to Blackwell when he was at the height of his power. Harper accepted their words with grace, understanding that fear made people do things they weren't proud of, and she harbored no ill will toward those who had simply been trying to survive. Within a month, the ranch was beginning to look like a working operation again. Fletcher hired some ranch hands, good men who knew horses and were eager to work for honest wages. They rebuilt the corrals and cleared the fields, and Harper began the process of acquiring breeding stock for her horse program. She had a vision for what she wanted to create, a line of horses known for their intelligence and temperament, animals that could be trusted in any situation. Life settled into a rhythm, the days filled with hard work, and the nights filled with the quiet intimacy of a happy marriage. Harper and Fletcher would sit on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the hills and talk about their day. Sometimes they would make love in the big bed in the master bedroom, learning each other's bodies with the patience and tenderness of people who knew they had all the time in the world. Sometimes They would just hold each other, finding comfort in the simple fact of not being alone. Harper had never been so happy. The grief over her parents' deaths would always be part of her, a scar she carried, but it no longer defined her. She had built a new life on the foundation of the old one, and she had done it with a man who understood her in ways no one else ever could. A year after they returned to the ranch, Harper discovered she was pregnant. She told Fletcher one evening as they sat on the porch, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, and she watched his face transform with wonder and joy. "A baby," he said, his voice hushed. "We're going to have a baby." "We are," Harper said, smiling through happy tears. "In about 6 months." Fletcher pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe, and she felt him tremble with emotion. "I'm going to be a father," he whispered against her hair. "I'm going to have a family." "You already have a family," Harper said, pulling back to look at him. "You have me, and soon you'll have our child, and we're going to fill this ranch with love and laughter and all the things that make a house a home." The pregnancy was difficult at times, Harper suffering from morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon and back pain that made it hard to sleep. But Fletcher was attentive and supportive, taking over more of the ranch work and insisting that she rest whenever she needed to. He would rub her aching back in the evenings and bring her mint tea in the mornings to settle her stomach, and Harper fell in love with him all over again, seeing the kind of father he was going to be. Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1880, arriving after a long and difficult labor that left Harper exhausted but euphoric. Fletcher was with her through the whole ordeal, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, and when the midwife finally placed the baby in Harper's arms, both of them wept with joy. "He's perfect," Fletcher said, staring at the tiny red face and the shock of dark hair. "He's absolutely perfect." They named him James, after Harper's father, and from the moment he was born, he became the center of their world. Harper had never known she could love someone so fiercely, so completely, as she loved this small person who depended on her for everything. She would sit in the rocking chair by the window, nursing James and watching the snow fall outside, and feel a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. Fletcher was a natural father, patient and gentle with their son. He would walk the floor with James when he was fussy, singing old cowboy songs in a surprisingly pleasant voice, and Harper would watch them and feel her heart swell with love. This was what she had fought for, she realized. Not just justice for her parents, though that had been important, but this life, this family, this future that she and Fletcher were building together. As James grew, the ranch prospered. Harper's horse breeding program became known throughout the territory, and people traveled from as far away as Kansas to buy her animals. Fletcher managed the business side of things with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. And together they built something that was profitable and sustainable. They expanded the house, adding rooms for more children, because Harper got pregnant again when James was 2 years old. This time it was twins, a boy and a girl they named Samuel and Grace. The birth was even more difficult than James's had been, and for a few terrifying hours, Fletcher thought he might lose Harper. But she pulled through, stubborn and strong as always, and soon the house was filled with the chaos and joy of 3 young children. Life was busy and often exhausting, the demands of raising children and running a ranch leaving little time for rest. But Harper wouldn't have traded it for anything. She would watch Fletcher teaching James to rope or playing with the twins in the yard, and she would think about how far they had come, how much they had overcome to get to this place of peace and happiness. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Harper would think about that day in Durango when she had run for her life, convinced she was broken beyond any repair. She would think about Fletcher's words, about broken things fitting together best, and she would smile. He had been right. Their brokenness hadn't made them weak. It had made them strong, had given them the ability to understand and appreciate what they had built together in a way that people who had never faced hardship might never fully grasp. The years passed, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Thomas Blackwell died in prison, unrepentant to the end, and Harper felt a grim satisfaction at the news but no real pleasure. Justice had been served, and that was enough. She didn't need to gloat over her enemy's downfall. She had more important things to focus on, like her family and her ranch and the life she was living with such fullness and purpose. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the horses as much as his mother did. Samuel was more adventurous, always getting into trouble, and Grace was sweet and gentle, with a gift for music that surprised everyone. Fletcher taught them all to ride and rope and shoot, the practical skills they would need to survive in this still, wild country. And Harper taught them to be kind and honest and to stand up for what was right. When James was 10 years old, he came to Harper one day with questions about his grandparents, about the people he had never met. Harper took him out to the family cemetery on the hill behind the house, where she had placed markers for her mother and father, and she told him the story of what had happened, of how his grandparents had died, and how she and his father had fought to bring their killers to justice. James listened with wide eyes, and when she was finished, he said, "You and Papa are brave." Harper smiled and ruffled his hair. "We did what we had to do, and we had each other, which made all the difference." "I want to be brave like you," James said solemnly. "You already are," Harper assured him. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared. You remember that and you'll be just fine." They stood together in the cemetery, mother and son, looking at the markers and the land that stretched out below them. And Harper felt a profound sense of continuity, of being part of something larger than herself. Her parents' legacy lived on in her children, in the ranch that bore their name, in the values she and Fletcher were instilling in the next generation. More years passed, and the children grew into young adults. James stayed on the ranch, taking over more and more of the day-to-day operations as Fletcher's hair turned gray and Harper's joints began to ache with the approach of age. Samuel went off to become a lawman like Marshall Reed, inspired by the stories of his parents' fight for justice. Grace married a kind man from a neighboring ranch and moved away, though she visited often with her own growing family. Harper and Fletcher grew old together, their love deepening and maturing like good wine. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, just as they had done when they were young, watching the sun set and talking about the day. Fletcher's hand would find Harper's, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice, and they would sit in comfortable silence, needing no words to communicate the depth of their feelings. "You ever regret it?" Fletcher asked one evening when they were both in their 60s, their hair gray and their faces lined with the passage of time. "The life we built, the choices we made." Harper looked at him, at the man who had saved her life and given her a reason to keep living, who had loved her through all the hard years and the good ones, and she smiled. "Not for a single moment. You—" "Never," Fletcher said firmly. "Helping you that day in the stable was the best decision I ever made. Everything good in my life came from that choice." "We were lucky," Harper said softly. "We found each other when we both needed someone most." "It was more than luck," Fletcher said. "It was fate. We were meant to find each other, meant to build this life together. I believe that with everything I am." Harper leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, and closed her eyes. "I believe it too." They stayed like that until the stars came out. Two people who had been broken and had healed each other, who had built something beautiful from the ruins of what they had lost. And when they finally went inside to bed, walking slowly with the careful steps of age, they did so hand in hand, just as they had done everything for the past 40 years, together. The ranch continued to thrive under James's management, and Harper lived to see her grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren born. She never lost her passion for horses, still visiting the stables every day to check on the animals and offer advice to the younger generation of trainers and breeders who carried on her work. Fletcher remained her constant companion, her partner in all things until the very end. When he died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Harper felt as though a part of her soul had been torn away. But even in her grief, she was grateful for the years they had shared, for the love they had built and the family they had raised. She lived for 3 more years after Fletcher's death, years that were quieter and more solitary, but not without joy. She found comfort in her children and grandchildren, in the continued success of the ranch, and in the memories of a life well lived. She would often sit on the porch in the evenings, imagining Fletcher beside her, feeling his presence even though he was gone. When Harper died at the age of 81, surrounded by family in the house where she had raised her children, her last thoughts were of Fletcher and of the promise they had made to each other all those years ago. They had built a life together from broken pieces, had created something lasting and beautiful out of pain and loss. They had loved each other fiercely and well, and that love had echoed through generations, shaping the lives of children and grandchildren who would never fully understand the sacrifices that had been made on their behalf. Harper was buried beside Fletcher on the hill overlooking the ranch, their headstones side by side just as they had always been in life. And on summer evenings, when the wind blew down from the mountains and the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange, the people who lived on the ranch would swear they could feel the presence of the couple who had built it all, 2 broken souls who had found each other and created something whole. The story of Harper and Fletcher Young became legend in the territory, told and retold around campfires and in saloons, a tale of courage and justice and love that endured. People spoke of the woman who had stood up to one of the most powerful men in Colorado and the cowboy who had helped her bring him to justice. They spoke of the ranch they had built and the family they had raised, of the legacy of honor and integrity they had left behind. And somewhere in those stories, in the telling and retelling, the essential truth remained, that even the most broken people can heal, that love can grow in the harshest conditions, and that 2 people who fit together can withstand anything the world throws at them, so long as they face it side by side. The Ashford Ranch, which eventually took the Young name, continued for generations, each successive owner adding to the legacy that Harper and Fletcher had begun. The house was expanded and modernized, but the original rooms were preserved, kept as they had been when Harper and Fletcher lived there, a shrine to the couple who had started it all. And on the porch, the same porch where Harper and Fletcher had spent so many evenings watching the sunset, their descendants would sit and tell stories about the remarkable people who had built their world from nothing, who had taken broken lives and forged them into something beautiful and lasting and true. In the end, that was the real legacy, not just the land or the horses or the wealth that had been accumulated over the years, but the example of 2 people who had loved each other completely and had built a life based on that love, a life that had rippled outward through time, touching and shaping everyone who came after them. Harper had been right when she said she was broken beyond repair. What she hadn't understood then, what Fletcher had known instinctively, was that repair wasn't the goal. The goal was transformation, taking broken pieces and arranging them into something new, something that bore the marks of its brokenness, but was stronger and more beautiful because of them. That was what they had done, what they had been for each other and for the family they created. They had been two broken things that fit together perfectly, and in that fitting together, they had made something whole. And so the story ended, not with tragedy or sorrow, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, of love given and received, of broken things made whole through the simple act of refusing to give up, of choosing to fight and to build and to love with everything they had. Harper Ashford and Fletcher Young had started with nothing but pain and loss, and a desperate need for justice. They had ended with everything that mattered: love, family, legacy, and the knowledge that they had made a difference in the world, that they had stood up against evil and won, that they had taken their broken pieces and created something beautiful. That was their story, and it was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations as an example of what two people can accomplish when they find each other at exactly the right moment, when they recognize in each other the possibility of healing and choose to pursue it with everything they have. In the wild and unforgiving landscape of the American frontier in the late 19th century, where life was hard and justice was often arbitrary and survival was never guaranteed, Harper and Fletcher Young had built something that lasted, something that mattered, something that proved that even in the darkest times, even when you feel broken beyond any repair, there is always the possibility of redemption, of healing, of love. That was the legacy of Harper and Fletcher Young, and it lived on long after they were gone, a testament to the power of love and the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that broken things really do fit together best, and that from that fitting together, something extraordinary can emerge.